Hello, everyone. Let me introduce myself to those of you good Canadian funeral professionals that I have not met over my 40 years of working and traveling in the great dominion of Canada. My name is Todd Van Beck, and I have had the great pleasure over a long, long period of time to have very, very good relationships and experiences with the brothers and sisters in our beloved profession that make up the Canadian funeral service profession. And so it's an honor for me to be with you today, albeit this artificial mechanism that seems still to be the norm, but just maybe temporarily that we can see an end to this global uh, scourge on the human race. Um, I've been asked to make a few comments over the next few minutes about uh, our beloved profession. And I chose that term, beloved profession, because I've concluded, and I don't think I'm wrong on this, I've not always been wrong on things, that the greatest asset that the funeral profession has, and any profession for that matter, is a genuine love of the members of that profession in their ministry, their mission, and their calling as to what is the tasks at hand in helping to serve the human race. In the funeral profession, of course, we have two very important tasks that we assume when we enter this. One is caretaker of the dead, which I personally think is a very, very important role to play because the dead cannot possibly take care of themselves. And to not take care of the dead is unlawful, unsanitary, and uncaring. The second role that I see, or tasks, a duty, responsibility, is the caregiving to the living. And that is not particularly an easy task. I have long been of the opinion that the greatest asset that we have in our profession are the families we serve. And in the beginning of the 21st century, actually at the end of the 20th century, the biggest pain in the neck, the biggest annoyance, the biggest irritant are some of the families that we serve. It takes a tremendous amount today of patience and tolerance and understanding to deal, serve, minister to some of the family units that clearly qualify as dysfunctional. Now, this isn't a program on dealing with dysfunctional families, but I've been in the funeral profession for 52 years, and I am living witness that the number of dysfunctional families that you and I are privileged to serve has exponentially increased year by year. Right? So we're not going to be Pollyanna here, and we certainly don't have all of the answers for the work that we'll be doing over the next several minutes in this. But I wanted to visit with you a little bit, funeral professional to funeral professional. Whether or not you're a veteran funeral director or you're an entry level person, every one of us on this call, somewhere, sometime, someplace, every one of us have this in common, whether or not we're Canadian or from the United States, from Europe, South America, I've spoken to all these places, New Zealand, Australia, everybody that's in our profession at one time or another had to make a decision to go into this line of work. And so we have that in common. Now, for a fellow like me, who is somewhat of a near do well, has made every mistake there is to make in the funeral book, I have to say this after 5 decades in this profession, for all of the negativity, for all of the complaining, for all of the frustrations and disappointments that we run into, um, becoming a funeral director was without question the best decision I have ever made in my life. And the reason that it's been a great decision is because of the myriad of experiences that the funeral profession presented itself to a fellow like me who was born on a farm in southwestern Iowa, had no family in the funeral profession, but from an early age uh, had this intense interest in everything to do with funerals. I, 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 I never drew the line that I didn't want to embalm a body. Um, I didn't draw the line that I wasn't interested in pre-need. I didn't draw the line as to I just wanted to make arrangements or go on funerals, or I never did that, and it made all the difference in the world because the experiences that the 100% death rate presents us were some of the most moving, touching, um, frustrating, sad, distasteful, joyful, jubilant experiences in my life. And so, thank you for inviting me to be with you today. And I hope that the remarks that I share with you will have some meaning for your very noble mission in this conference that you folks are holding. Um, every one of us on this call, on this program, on this session that we're recording now, you have a story as to what happened in your life to get you interested in funeral service. Now, I am a big believer in storytelling. In fact, I've based most of my career, particularly on seminars and in the written word that goes into the professional journals. I have based most of my work on storytelling. That the story gets told, and then the points that the story illustrates begins to evolve into either a presentation such as we're doing today, or a written word that would be hopefully accepted by the publishers of our professional journals. I have found the story is one of the great assets for mental health for funeral directors. I don't know if you ran into this in your career, but all my career, from the beginning, I've run into naysayers, grumpy people, negative people, complaining people. We have an abundance of that in our profession. I'm of the opinion that every profession has an abundance of grumpy, negative, naysaying people. But I'm not in another profession. I'm in funeral service. So when I made my decision to become a funeral director, I'm going to share that with you very quickly in a minute. I had just a slew of human beings. I think, I hope they were trying to help me, but it wasn't any help at all. But I would have my mother, God rest her soul. My mother, when I told her what I was going to want to do as a career, she burst into tears and locked herself in the bathroom. Not a particularly motivational experience, but something had happened, and I believe I could maybe project this, that for many of you listening to this, something happened in your life. I now deal on a day-to-day basis with what I call affectionately the baby undertakers of the world, right? The young people, the young funeral that are in mortuary college, and I say that with very much affection. They're great people, but they're not veteran funeral directors, right? Any stretch of the imagination. They think they are, right? But they're baby undertakers, and we've all been there. I was there, thought I knew much more than I truly did um, when I was in school. But I had the negativity and the naysayers uh, in the beginning of my career, such as, "Oh, are you sure you want to do that?" Or there'd just be this dead silence, and they would look at me, they'd say, "No, what are you studying to do?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm studying to be a funeral director and embalmer." And here's what they would say: they'd look at me and they go, "Oh, that'd be it, right? It wasn't. Congratulations. My goodness, you made a great decision." It would be a one syllable utterance. Right? It's not even really a word, is it? It just, oh, like that. Right? And okay, fine. It never ever slowed me down, though. Right? I had things that slowed me down, but the response of the naysayers, because I still have got naysayers, right? I still have people out there that have got something to say, and it's usually not positive at times, about being a funeral director, right? But the spark, I call it a spark. I think the spark is there, and it's the genesis of the spark is from the story. So all of you have to have a story of how you ended up in this. Um, you you had something happen in your life. You went to a funeral. You met a funeral director. Your family legacy was in funeral service. Those are all stories. So I remember in looking at this in the notes that I wrote down to share with you. Um, I I went to a funeral when I was 5 years old. This happened when I was 5 years old, and in our little town, some of you that are listening to this are from farming communities, and so you will understand that in small farming communities, like the one I came from, if you were the Massey Ferguson, Massey Harris, John Deere, International Harvester dealer in these little towns that were basically agricultural centers, you were royalty, right? Because the farmers all depended upon planting time, combine would fall apart, or not planting at a combine, but the planter would fall apart, or in harvesting, the combine would fall apart, and into town you'd take the equipment. And in our little town, we had this family called the Nortons, Norton, and they were old pioneer people in our town. My grandmother was a registered nurse. She was an interesting human being. She graduated in 1909 from nursing school, and the course was 90 days long, and she became a registered nurse. My, how things have changed. And when I was growing up, she was kind of we didn't know about hospice in those days, but my grandmother was the hospice go-to person. If somebody was dying, right, they almost all died at home. They would hire my grandmother, and my grandmother would nurse them, just like hospice does today, over a period of weeks and months until the death occurred. And Mrs. Norton, when I was a kid, was really in bad shape, right? She was a physical wreck. And so they hired my grandmother to nurse her. And my grandmother moved in to the Norton home. They gave her a room she could sleep in, 24-hour nursing care. And I really loved it because I could go down there and visit my grandmother anytime I wanted, and she treated me like I was a king. She always treated me, I always suspected I was her favorite grandchild, see. She just treated me like a king. But I also was very interested in sneaking a peek of Mrs. Norton. She was in a back bedroom. She was very clean. My grandmother was a meticulous nurse. But she was a wreck. She was going into the fetal position. Her hair had not been done. It was clean and combed, but she did not have any teeth in. She wore dentures. The teeth were out. She had facial hair that wasn't needed to be tended to because she wasn't going anywhere. And I would go down there and sneak a look at her. And my grandmother would catch me and scold me. And, the admonition was, leave that woman alone. She's got trouble. And so one day, it was afternoon, maybe 5, before supper, my mother came in and said, Mrs. Norton died the night before. Your grandmother was with her. And that tonight we're going to the funeral home to see Mrs. Norton. And I remember very vividly that I protested about going. I'd never been in a funeral home in my life. There was no reason to, right? But I protested because I took the position that I'd seen enough of her. Right? I'd seen her in her hospital bed. I'd gotten into trouble every bloody time I went to look at her. So it was like classical conditioning. Why would I want to do that again and get into trouble? And my father was very stern, and he said, you're going with us to the funeral home. And so I remember this vividly. And I hope I don't bore you folks by an old man reminiscing about something that happened decades ago. But I remember walking into the front door, into the building, and the first thing that I remember is I smelled flowers. Now, I used to curse funeral flowers, all that green crap that the florist had put in there. I thought the florist didn't like us because I thought they put little explosive devices in the mums because those bloody damn mums would just blow up and 1,000 mum petals are all over the carpet. The flowers would be dead. The flowers would be late. Then they'd put the chicken wire in there and I'd stick my thumb down there in a basket. I'd get a bloody thumb. And the dry cleaner in town always knew my suits, right? Because I was the only man in town, right, that had pockets full of dead flower petals from picking those bloody things up off the floor and stuffing them in my pocket 10 minutes before a funeral would take off. So I was anti-flowers. I was anti-florist. I didn't like them. I don't think they liked me. But I look back at that now, and was I ever wrong? because my first vivid memory of anything to do with our beloved profession is flowers. Because the minute I smell flowers, and to this very day, when I go anywhere, to a wedding, to a birthday party, to a funeral, and there's flowers there, the minute I smell that, I know, I feel this sense of old security. And I'll tell you why. And maybe some of you have these precious memories about your grandparents, your grandmother. I would give a year's pay to have one more afternoon with my grandmother, standing in her flower garden, picking flowers with her. Isn't that interesting? Here is a man now my age, looking back at a long career, and the precious memory is a little kid standing in a garden in southwestern Iowa with an old lady, and we're picking flowers. And I look back at that as this indelible comfort in my life. So still today, when I smell flowers, I think of my grandmother. I'm on safe territory. I remember walking in, and it was a big old house. You know, it wasn't a very sophisticated funeral home. Not a stick of furniture matched in the place. Two bachelor brothers were our local undertakers, um, and we loved them. Right, we forgave them for all their mistakes they would make, and we forgave them because we liked them. Right, that's a real business lesson. People will forgive you if they know you and like you. That's just psychology 101. But I remember walking around the corner and I looked down, and there was this absolutely gorgeous scene. There were flowers all over the place, and I walked over to the casket with my mother, and I stood there and I couldn't believe it. I still, to this very day, if I go into a funeral home and sit and stare at a dead body in a casket long enough, my memory is right back to the story that I'm telling you today. I have never forgotten it. Mrs. Norton looked beautiful. Uh, her hair was perfectly done. They had her in a blue suit. Her hands weren't shaking. Her teeth, her mouth looked one. They had the mouth closure absolutely spot. I didn't even know what a mouth closure was, but I knew that they had done something to her. And I remember looking at Mother, and I said to her, "Why do they have her in this treasure chest?" And my mother, through a pure heart, looked at me and said, "Because she was a treasure. We all loved her very much." That is a matter of the human heart. And I have a business theory that nothing good happens in funeral service unless something first good happens in a funeral director's heart. All funeral service ultimately is a matter of our hearts. So I'd like you to think about your story as we move on in our short time together today. I want you to think about the story because, and this is just for me, I'm not trying to project this to anybody else. I had a family one time. Two brothers were in the arrangement office, and they got into it, right? And they got into it in a big way. And I bet you there's a lot of you listening to this that know exactly what I'm talking about. And in the middle of this thing, one of the brothers pulled a damn gun out, right? And I'm sitting there. Oh, I'm sitting there, and it's like, boy, they didn't cover this in mortuary college, right? And we diffuse the situation, but I have to say this out of a love of our work and a love of our great profession. The minute I saw that family going into the twilight zone, and that's where they went, no question. I had no control over that. I started to think about the treasure chest. I started to think about my family and some of the really, really strange people that made up my family when I was growing up. So I pass this on to you that with all sincerity of purpose, your story can help carry us through the frustrations and the annoyances and the irritations that I find every funeral director on the face of the earth, not just in the 21st century, but I have found, looking back at my career, we never were not without annoyances and frustrations and disappointments in our profession, right? We simply deal with that, right? And we deal with it, and funeral directors get high marks for being trusted and being respected in their communities because you and I have developed this very admirable method of not just coping with disappointments and frustrations, but being able to prevail over them. And that is quite a skill that we should be rightfully taking our honor and self pride in our abilities to do that as funeral professionals. Now, there's two things that I'm asked a lot of times as to the two, well, they ask me what is the biggest threat that I see facing the funeral profession. Well, I have two things that I've seen, and I'm not judging it. I'm just giving you and you probably could add a few more to it. First of all is the secularization of the society. Now, for years, right, for years, I have watched that the community's ability or their interest or their attraction to being associated with a formalized religious organization has continued to dwindle. It's dwindled in Canada and it's dwindled in the United States, right? Now, for years, we know that this has been going on. The consequences of that to the funeral profession is very significant, right? Because for basically 60,000 years, until the last 70 years, the funeral was essentially, the DNA of a funeral essentially was a religious experience. All right, so they asked me, what do you see? All right, the secularization of society. So the answer to that, and I certainly applaud this and support it, is the funeral directors and funeral companies in Canada and the United States that embrace the celebrant programs. And people say, oh, never in my funeral home. Well, I can honor that. You know, we can't force anyone to do anything. But in funeral homes that use the celebrant program, it's been well received overall. And the training for that is easily ahead. And I know that there's several people in Canada that have been extremely active in the celebrant movement and in training. I personally applaud that. The second one that has caught my attention is just as significant, right? I don't know if a funeral home has the capacity to get people connected back to a religious experience. I don't even think it's the funeral directors or the funeral home's responsibility to do that, right? Right. But the next one that I want to visit with you about is clearly within the preview of what you and I can do. There's so much that I could visit with you about, but I'm going to make the big picture stuff here in the short time that we have. When Mrs. Norton died, take a guess how long they laid her body out for, right? Go back to Iowa, take a guess, farming community, just like the prairies in Canada, right? It just, I mean, Canada is just one state north of Iowa, right? I mean, you go Iowa, Minnesota, Canada, right? So you go to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, um, you take Calgary, you take Winnipeg, you take Edmonton out, you got Iowa, right? It's all farmland, it's all farmers, right? How long do you think we laid her body out? We laid her body out for 3 days, right? She was embalmed. She was in a Belmont casket. She was in a Wilbert concrete vault. She got buried, but we laid her out for 3 days. Right? Now remember, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, so if I can figure this out, right, I would say there's worth to the observation. If Van Beck can come up with something like this. And it wasn't 2 to 4, 7 to 9. It wasn't 6 to 9. It wasn't 5 to 7. It was all day long into the night. And nobody complained that it was exhausting, that the family had to go through too much. Nobody said that kind of stuff, right? Because we all knew Mrs. Norton. Her husband had fixed the combine. We thought the world of him, and she was a treasure. Now, I don't claim any expertise in anything, right? Because I have to tell you, if it could go wrong on funerals, it went wrong on my funerals, right? There were times I thought I was doing well if I didn't bring the body back from the cemetery, that I was able to get the person buried. And that's no exaggeration. But everywhere I travel, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, England, all over the place, I read obituaries. Don't read them in newspapers all that much anymore because they're too damned expensive in the cities, right? But I do read them online. And here's what I read: calling hours 3 to 6, calling hours 2 to 4, 7 to 9, calling hours 5 to 7, right? One day, I read an obituary in Cincinnati a couple months ago, and it was calling hours at 11, funeral at noon, 1 hour, right? Then I read obituaries, funeral convenient. This was going on before COVID, right? COVID's got nothing to do with what I'm talking about, right? All right, COVID was a 100-year pandemic. This was going on for the last 15, 20 years in my career. So the question is, if we've gone from 3 days ritualizing our dead to 3 hours here and there now and then, if we get that, my brothers and sisters in our beloved profession, what is all this going to look like in the year 2035? So the second big issue is time. And so the question comes up, what can we do that is of an experience of value with the time that we have with them? That is a valuable question. Right? Now, at the end of this, I'll give you a little commercial. It's all free. I've got a bunch of programs that I've always been happy to share that addresses this issue of the visibility of the funeral home, of the visibility of the funeral director, right? In some of you have been to the ICCFA University that for years was held at the University of Memphis, and now it's held at the Emory University in Atlanta. And I know some of you we have had several Canadian uh, funeral professionals go through the Funeral Management College. I happen to teach that college. And in that, we have the total quality management theories of a man named Dr. W. Edwards Deming, Deming. If you're unfamiliar with Dr. Deming, I would encourage you to Google him and just start to read about him. One of Deming's hallmark business theories is called visibility. Right? So I just laid out for you that the visibility of dead bodies, of funerals, of the ritual and the ceremony is abbreviating itself, right? And I know this to be true. The number of dead bodies that we are embalming chemically in the United States is dropping. And I talked to a bunch of my brothers and sisters in Canada, and the report is exactly the same. The number of dead bodies that are going into caskets in the United States is continuing to drop. And I talked to a bunch of my Canadian brothers and sisters in funeral service, and the report is the same, right? So visibility is, I think, something that if we take nothing else out of my time that you folks have generously given to me, and I do appreciate this opportunity. I wish you and I were in the same room together so I could kiss babies and shake hands, but maybe someday that will be possible again. So the greatest resource, right? Funeral homes have two great resources. I think this is right. The first great resource is the building itself, the funeral home. And the second greatest resource, and they are equal, they're separate but equal, is the people that work in that building, right? Hopefully, the majority of them are not naysayers. Hopefully, the majority of them don't spend a whole workday complaining about what they don't like about the world. But there's a bunch of funeral homes that, truthfully, the staff will spend most of the day complaining about what they don't like. I guess that's human nature, but it doesn't solve anything, right? But what does solve something is for the funeral home and the staff to become more visible in other ways than just doing funerals. I just said to you, right? The number of dead bodies that are being funeralized is dropping, right? The time people use to do funerals is dropping. And overall, attendance to funerals is dropping. Attendance to church is dropping, right? The sociologists say it's a new day. And Lord above, isn't that the true statement? It is a new day. So the old historic formulas and the old historic approaches that worked really, really well when I started may not have the same impact that it did 50 years ago. In fact, I can tell you, it doesn't have the same impact that it had 50 years ago. So what do? One idea is to get more people into the funeral home in other opportunities than attending a funeral, right? And I can see some folks rolling their eyeballs, and they'll go to the leadership of the association and say, don't have Van Beck back Well, okay, I got a lot of people that don't like me over the years, but it doesn't invalidate the idea of people getting into the funeral home. So how do you do that? Right? There's a program that I'd be happy to send you to on how to do a tour of your funeral home. And be all we've done tours, not that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about generating tours, right? Now, when I was managing and owned funeral homes, I was kind of like Santa Claus when it came to donations because I didn't want to get anybody upset with me, which was impossible, right? I mean, you can't be all things to all people, but I thought if I gave the fraternal order of court jesters, if I gave the fraternal order of XYZ $100 and get my name in their semi-annual souvenir brochure, they'd be all happy. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't. Looking back, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. I was paying money out, and I couldn't. I could not hook up a death call with some of those ads if the Lord Himself asked me to prove it. So we came up with this idea of we would pay groups. We would make a contribution to groups if they came over and took a tour of the mortuary. So at the time, we started this in 1977. We gave $1 a member. So if you brought 50 members over, we'd give you $50. And guess what? It just took off. I think it was really easy money, right? I was in Rotary for years, and we made money by selling brooms. Right here, I am walking up and down the street with a handful of brooms, knocking on doors at 7:30 at night, honking people off. They're getting upset. Versus sitting in a beautiful room with a cup of coffee and a muffin and listening to the funeral directors talk about the value, purpose, and benefit of the funeral. We desperately need funeral directors to talk to the public, not about gauge caskets, not about products, about the value, purpose, and benefit of the funeral ritual. Because here's one: if you and I don't stand up and speak a loud voice on behalf of the value, purpose, and benefit of the funeral, who the hell's going to do it? I went 3 years to seminary. Do you know how many courses in bereavement counseling and psychology of grief we took to graduate? Not one. The mortuary schools in Canada teach these courses routinely. The mortuary schools in the States, they teach this routinely. The mortuary school in Wellington, New Zealand, they teach psychology of grief, but not in the seminary, right? And so we would start giving these tours. And, I didn't like doing them, right? I was grumpy and cranky, and, sometimes it'd just be these groups, and you just, oh, Lord, let's get this over with. We've had 5 funerals this day, and now we've got the sewing circle from St. Clement's Church taking a tour because they need 30 extra bucks, quick money. And I was grumpy and cranky and fussy about it. Boy, was I wrong. John Turner, who owned the funeral home, came down one day and he said, we got a tour coming in tonight, all right? 59th second of the 11th hour. And I said, well, who's coming in? He goes, a group of Cub Scouts. And I just hit the roof. It was like, good God, John, you set up a tour with a bunch of 8, 9, 10-year-old boys. I said, what do you, why would we want Cub Scouts to take a tour of a funeral home for? And he said, oh, I don't know. He said, I set it up and you're giving the tour. Well, lucky Todd, right? And so about 7 o'clock, here it come. We were given $1 for each member. I wrote a check out for $72. There were 72 10-year-old boys on this tour. I don't know if you've ever been around one 10-year-old boy, but this was the tour from hell, right? These boys were like an Old Testament locust plague. They were like a mosquito plague. They were all over the place, touching stuff, um, asking stupid questions. They seemed to be addicted to the water cooler because it was the old-fashioned type that you get a bubble that would come up. Then they'd have to go pee, and then they make a big mess up in the men's room. And boy, by the time they left, I was one grumpy, cranky, fussy old undertaker. And I went home and complained all night long to my lovely bride, um, and went back to work the next day. About 5:30 that next afternoon, Percy Harris, who was the Lynn County coroner, called the funeral home and said that a man had dropped dead at his dinner table in North Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was 39 years old. Now, I was no rookie at house calls by then. And so I get the other fellow and off we go. Went in there, and sure enough, here this poor guy is on the kitchen floor. I'm down on my hands and knees pulling out his money clip and his wallet and giving it to the sheriff. His wife is in the front room sobbing and weeping. Thank heavens we got the priest to come over, and he comforted her, and I made an appointment with him at 10 o'clock the next morning at the funeral home. And at 10 o'clock, she was prompt, right, which I really appreciated because late families always unnerved me. And she came in with her parents now, her sister, and she now has a 10-year-old boy with her. And as I sat down to make arrangements, this little boy, his name was Roland Henry, Roland stood up and he walks right over to me, and he's mustering every ounce of courage he's got. And he looks at me and he goes, do you remember who I am, mister? And I looked at him and I couldn't place him at all. And finally, the mother looks and she said, well, you might not recognize him. He was part of the Cub Scouts that took the tour last night. And my heart just hit the floor because I started to connect the dots. And I looked at him and I said, is this your father? And Roland said, yeah, this is my pop. I'm so sorry, son. You've all had these show-stopping moments in your career. I know you have. The mother looked off into space and she goes, what am I supposed to do? I don't know what to do. And I got up to, hell, I don't know what I was going to say to her, right? Because they didn't cover that in mortuary school. And Roland beat me over to his mother, and he looked at his mother with this look that only a little boy can give his mother, which is pure, unadulterated love. And he put his hands on his mother's cheeks and he said, don't worry, Mommy, I know what to do. I've been through this whole building. Now, a week later, after the funeral was over, she sent me a letter. And whether you agree with the religious connotation of this letter, I certainly don't mean to proselytize here, but this is what she said. She said, when I found out that the Cub Scouts were going to take a tour of a funeral home, she said, I didn't want to let Roland go because I was fearful for him. And I thought that he'd have the rest of his life to face up to the sorrows and sadnesses and the disappointments that life had in store for him. She said, but we're Christians. And she said, given what happened in my family, I know the good Lord Jesus Christ sent him over there that night because he got the right information from the right people in the right way, and he used it within 24 hours. So it wasn't so much what I did, it was the presence of the funeral home. It was what was inside the funeral home that taught this 10-year-old boy, who I thought wasn't listening to anything that anybody was saying, and boy was I wrong. That little Roland Henry was hanging on every word that was coming out of my flawed vocal cords. The funeral home is a powerful symbol in communities, and the people that work in the funeral home are even a more powerful symbol about being able to face up to the reality of death. I would suggest to you this also in this idea of visibility. The funeral home is the last place in a community that attests that people die. Now, cemeteries are there, and certainly you go to Mount Pleasant, and boy, you've got some magnificent death symbols, funerary architecture in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Toronto. I've been there 100 times. But when you start to drive through Mount Pleasant and you get into the newer sections of the cemetery, an interesting thing happens to the funerary architecture, does it not? The monuments get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then in some sections, the monuments are flat, the markers are flat to the ground for the convenience, of course, of the lawnmower, right? But the bigger question for funeral professionals is what happens when your cemeteries look like golf courses and you can't see the symbols of death? And I'll give you one other one on this, of why it's important that you and I get people inside our buildings for other educational opportunities other than sitting on a funeral service. When I joined forces here at the mortuary school, the students, we have a contract with the Veterans Hospital where we will do the embalming for the indigent veterans. And we got a death call. I hadn't been in the building 48 hours. And I said, I'll go over and get the body. And one of the staff members said, well, you can't go there. You don't know where the morgue entrance is. And I didn't mean to be flippant, and I certainly don't mean to be flippant now. But I'm not a rookie at this, right? And I looked at her and I said, I don't need to know where the morgue entrance is. All I got to do is find the damn garbage dumpsters. And I've got the door to the morgue. Visibility. A couple last points, and then there's some prearranged questions that have been sent in that I'd like to address. Won't take much more of your time. Some of you will remember a book called The American Way of Death. And The American Way of Death was written by a woman named Jessica Mitford. For the younger funeral professionals on this call, if you've never heard of The American Way of Death and you have never heard of Jessica Mitford, and they have not mentioned this once in your mortuary school curriculum, you need to go to your professors and say, who is this person and where is this book at? And you need to sit down and read it. The book came out in 1963, and I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of it. The book basically made fun of us, which is a very common defense mechanism when people are confronting death. How many of you have had this, oh, You work in a funeral home, but I bet business is a little dead up there, or this one. People are dying to get into your place. And these people think that this is something new, that it's original, that you and I have never heard this stuff before, right? But it's humor. And Jessica was funny. She was. I'm going to tell you a story about her in a minute. But she wrote this book about 350 pages long that basically said we're a bunch of crooks, funeral directors, we're thieves, we take advantage of widows and orphans, and she just took us to task. I remember the first time I read that, I just sat on the edge of my bed and started crying because I thought, what's wrong with me? How in the world? Now I was young then, right? So I was insecure with funeral stuff. I'm not insecure with funeral stuff anymore. So I look, what's wrong with me? How could I possibly? What's wrong with me? Be so in love with a line of work that is so bad. Well, Jessica, there's a whole story about Jessica of why she wrote the book. She had horrible experiences with death in her life. And that's another seminar. But I got invited. The main guy that was supposed to debate Jessica, this is back in like 1992, right? The main guy that was supposed to debate Jessica got sick, right? So, and this has happened to me a lot in my career. The main speaker gets sick, and the people in the organization go, geez, who can we get to be second fiddle here? Oh, let's call Van Beck, right? So a lot of my speaking engagements over the years is that I'm not the primary guy. I'm down on the food chain a little bit. And okay, and so I went out to Oakland, California. That's where she lived. And we were going to have this point counterpoint debate on the pros and cons of funerals. And Jessica started in making fun of us, right? And listen, she was funny. She's a lot. She is a lot more humorous than I ever can be, right? And the crowd just was laughing their fannies off, right? Because it makes people feel good to laugh at death, right? Laugh in the face of death, that kind of, Hollywood kind of stuff, right? Now, personally, I haven't found a lot funny about death, but that's because I'm a funeral director and Jessica wasn't a funeral director, right? So at the end, so anyway, I went out there and I just beat her up, right? And I'm proud of that. I walked out of there. I had won the debate, right? Because I had non-humorous, tangible, important information. I wasn't making fun of anybody. I was serious about this stuff because it's a serious subject. But she caught me out in the hallway, and I'll pass this on to you. She said, Mr. Van Beck, may I have a moment of your time? And I couldn't stand that woman, right? I'm telling you straight out, you can broadcast this all over, wherever you want to. I couldn't stand that woman. But, yes, you surely, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, Miss Misford. And she goes, you want to know the major problem with funeral directors? Oh boy, those were fighting words. I could feel my Dutch going right up. And I said, no, ma'am, what, be gracious. And she said, they stop believing in what they're doing. I'll repeat that. Jessica Mitford said, they stop believing in what they're doing. And when that happens, it opens the door for people like me. When I started this program about an hour ago, I said the greatest asset that a funeral director can have is not how well they did in mortuary school, not how well they did on the boards. Nobody's going to ask you what score you got on the boards when their son's been killed, right? The greatest asset that you and I can possibly have is a belief in what we're doing, because a belief in what you're doing and a love of your profession are two things that no one can take from you. Nobody can take those two assets. They may not agree with it. They may think, they may be critical of it, and they may be naysayers. We have an abundance of naysayers. But in the end, nobody has ever been able to touch my belief in what I do to contribute to our beloved profession and my genuine, honest, heartfelt love of this great profession. Now, I want to end with by answering a couple questions. One of the questions, let me get the thing here. It says, "What do you think is the future of the funeral profession?" I have an easy answer for that. The future of the funeral profession is going to be precisely what you and I make out of it. The future of the funeral profession is totally predicated on the attitude of the funeral professionals across the globe. The future of the funeral profession calls out for creativity, and I am of the opinion that it is the creative funeral professional that will be garnering the service opportunities as the calendar marches on. I want to end by sharing this little verse with you. In fact, last time I read it in Canada was at Harry Rath's funeral, and many of you may be listening to this were at that service. The first time I read this little verse that Harry heard was at the hotel at the Pearson International. We were having a conference out there, and I had known Harry, but I had never had a chance to share this verse. And as I'm reading this verse, Harry was in the front row, tears streaming down his face because he was so touched by the sentiment of this. Before I recite this little poem, I want to ask you that if there's anything I can do to be of service to you, if you're interested in the programs that have been developed over the years here to enhance the visibility of your funeral home, to help you show attention, more attention, and to give tangible information about the value, purpose, and benefit of the funeral, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm easily found. I'm toddfanbeck@gmail.com, and there's no charge for these programs. So the little verse goes this way, and then my time with you good folk is done. I think the poet captures the mystical aspects of life, and I believe this little verse captures the mystical, almost unexplainable depth of the funeral profession and the realities of our profession. So here is what the poet said. "The midnight hour, the darkest hour that human grief may know, sends forth its hurried summons and asks me to come, I go. I know not where the blow may fall, I know not for whom the bell may toll. I only know that I must go in answer to their call. Perhaps a friend, perhaps unknown, it is fate that turns that wheel. The tangled schemes in human life wind slowly on the reel. And I'm the undertaker, cold-blooded you'll hear some say, trained to the shock and chill of death, with a heart that is cold and gray. Trained, is that what they call it? How little they know the rest. I'm human, and well understand the sorrow that throbs in the aching breast. God bless you all. God bless funeral service in the great dominion of Canada. And my fervent hope is that our paths will cross personally in a very short time. So God bless you all. Thank you. Bye.